Thank you very much. Thanks, folks. It's a tremendous honor to be here in Chicago. It's a city that my wife and I have particularly loved for many, many years. We've been coming here each year for many years. I'd like to particularly recognize one of our guys, our Swiftboat guys, that just happened to be here, and that's Vince Hummel. Vince, can you stand up? Thanks, Vince. Vince and I have actually never met before, although Vince was there from 68 to 69 in Da Nang on our same little boats, but I believe based on short conversation, we share exactly the same views. It's particularly fun for me to meet Paul Caprio, whom I haven't seen in many, many years, almost 25 years. I'd like to say that he has grown old and I've stayed young, but I'm afraid that's not exactly accurate. But he has been a friend for many, many years. I think that I should also like to recognize Buzz Patterson. Buzz, could you stand up? Buzz Patterson was the chief military aide to President Clinton. He was the guy that literally carried the nuclear football during the Clinton administration, a substantial part of that administration. He's written a previous bestseller. He's written a bestseller entitled Reckless Disregard right now that's on the New York Times bestseller list. It is really the bookend to my book because what it does is take John Kerry's actual career in the Senate and look at it over the last 20 years. Ironically, we didn't know of each other when we were writing our books, but our books in terms of John Kerry's Vietnam experience are absolute mirrors of each other, except that mine goes into it perhaps in a little more detail than Buzz's. I recommend Buzz's book very, very strongly to anybody that actually wants to get to the truth in connection with this whole matter. I think the very first question is, how did this all happen? How did this all, how did Swiftboat Veterans for Truth start? How did the book Unfit for Command actually get written? A book that's excited, people demonstrating against us and everything else, demonstrating against a book, which is kind of an unusual thing in this world. The way it actually happened for me is that I knew nothing about, hadn't seen John Kerry or been involved with him for much more than 30 years. Early this year, my wife Ann was critically ill, and Ann I dedicated the book to. Ann, can you stand up? What actually happened to me is in January and February, when Kerry became a serious candidate, I could have been less interested in John Kerry. She was critically ill, and I actually had occasion to donate a kidney to my wife Ann. She was transplanted with a kidney and was able to go off of dialysis and live a normal life. That was the greatest thing I ever did in my life. I sat, and after that transplant, I looked at it. I was in the hospital. I'll never forget it. I looked up at the screen, and there was John Kerry in a brown leather jacket, surrounded by the same 7 or 8 guys that always surround him. And, of course, we never wore brown leather jackets in Vietnam. Vince will tell you that. The temperature was 90 to 95 degrees. So it was all political theater. To me, it was like Lord of the Rings. Fortunately for us, long before that, a couple of months before, Admiral Roy Hoffman, who had commanded our unit in Vietnam, he had actually been contacted by John Kerry a year before when Kerry announced his presidential campaign. And Admiral Hoffman is 78. His ship was sunk. He was a World War II veteran. His ship was sunk in the Korean War. He almost died in the Sea of Japan. He was with us on our boats all the time. He was on at least 2 of the boats that sank. He had gotten a call from John Kerry trying to seek his endorsement for President of the United States. Admiral Hoffman thought it was Robert Kerry, the senator from Nebraska. And he was very enthusiastic about Robert Kerry and boy, we're there and everything. And then slowly he realized it was John Kerry. And the conversation sort of died off. That was the end of the conversation because none of us ever conceived that John Kerry could ever run and even be the candidate of a major party for President of the United States. A year later, when it became apparent that Kerry might be a serious candidate, Admiral Hoffman just began contacting people in 1s and 2s and 3s, he and his wife, who's about the same age, and finally contacted several hundred of us. By March or April of this past year, we were able to get together. We had at that time, we put out a letter. The letter was signed by the vast majority of all the swift boat people in Vietnam. For example, in Coastal Division 11, the little unit that John Kerry served in and that I served in later, 17 of the 23 officers who actually served with John Kerry, who bunked in the same bunk room most nights, signed this letter declaring John Kerry to be unfit to be Commander-in-Chief. There's a website picture that John Kerry uses on his website that shows 20 officers and John Kerry in the middle of it, like they're a band of brothers. There are only 15 of them who are able to declare what they think and who are still alive. Of those 15, after tremendous pressure from the Democratic campaign, 12 of them have declared that John Kerry is unfit for command. Only 3 of them support John Kerry. Of the sailors in Coastal Division 11, a large majority have indicated he's unfit for command. More than 274 sailors have now signed the letter. We went to Washington and we had a press conference. We thought naively that it would be carried fully, that maybe the Democratic Party would get somebody else, or at least they'd be well informed as to what the background was. It received little or no coverage. It was on C-SPAN and almost nothing else. The question then came out, how can we finally break through and tell people what we actually know about John Kerry based on our service with him, and his, in some cases, my case, his activity after Vietnam. We determined that we would do several things. First, we would put out an ad and see where the ad went and try and raise money for it and put it out, and we would develop a website. The ad we put out, first, the website that we created has gotten over 91,000 contributions. It's the largest number of contributions I think almost ever received by anything except a major political campaign. The average amount of the contributions has been something like $115, and therefore we've raised $10 million, literally from small contributions all over the United States, a few large ones, but an awful lot more small ones. The ads on the website have been downloaded more than 2 million times, one individual ad more than 2 million times, and circulated through the internet. And so the ads themselves, when we brought them up on the air, the Kerry campaign threatened directly the stations that were going to carry the ads. 20 of them all over the country said, if you bring this ad up, we're going to sue you. That was a fortunate development actually for us because it led to a great deal of coverage. Every single station carried the ad. Every single station has carried every ad after checking the factual background for them. So the ads led us to be able a little bit to make our point known. Finally, we wrote this book. The book is a book of over 60 people who served directly with Kerry. You know, it's funny, back in the 1500s, people were writing books. This is the age of telecommunications, so it's kind of ironic that we would sit and pick just a regular old book and put it out. We put the book out, and the book has been the #1 bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list, not because of any marketing genius by any of us, but because simply the facts in the book are the truth. That's why the book has sold. Now, I think the next question is, why did we come forward? What was it that motivated us? The answer of the Kerry campaign has always been that we were just sort of Republicans. It's a little hard to believe that 274 of us in this little coastal squadron were all just Republicans. In fact, we have almost nobody that has had any involvement, ever held a political office or had any serious involvement in politics for many, many, many years. The reasons that drove us forward are, I think, something that everybody understands, except if politics is their whole life, and that is that there are some things that are a whole lot more important than politics. Character, integrity, loyalty, loyalty to the people you serve with, decency, telling the truth. Those are all a lot more important to us. In addition, we would suggest there's something a whole lot more important than Republican and Democrat in the selection of a president. There's a starting point, and that starting point is to preserve, protect, and to defend the nation. That's the starting point before you hit any of these other issues. Our conclusion was, based on, in many cases, service directly with him, in my case, my observation of him afterwards, and on his boat, taking over his boat after he left, is that this was a guy peculiarly unfit to command the nation, peculiarly unfit to command our kids, my nephew, who's in the 82nd Airborne, the children of many of the people. Brocky Hildreth, for example, has the guy who is quoted extensively in the book, has a son who is a captain in Iraq. And he asked the question, I wouldn't want this guy in front of me or behind me in Vietnam. How can we ever send him to command our kids in Iraq and Afghanistan? And those are the factors that led us to write the book. Now, why do we feel that way? How did we reach that conclusion? I think we reached the conclusion primarily for three reasons. The first reason, and the smallest, is that he wildly exaggerated and lied about his service in Vietnam, not just 30 years ago, but as recently as 5 to 6 weeks ago. Second, and more important to us, he lied about our service in Vietnam. He portrayed us as war criminals. He, in effect, switched sides when he came back to the United States. And third, as to the future, he would be a terrible commander-in-chief in a time of crisis for the nation. I might go through each of those. First of all, the exaggeration of his own service in Vietnam. All of us served in our outfit a year in Vietnam. That was the standard tour of duty in Vietnam, unless somebody were seriously wounded or died there. John Kerry served only 3 months of combat and 1 month of training. He was never wounded in any real or serious way beyond a scratch. His scratches, at least 2 of them, were self-inflicted wounds. He didn't intend to wound himself, but he wounded himself by mistake. Let me explain. This is Bobby Mueller. He's been shouting down. He has a chair paid for by the Kerry campaign. He shouted down our rally 3 weeks ago in Washington. He shouted me down 30 years ago. He's a guy who put a wreath on the grave of Ho Chi Minh with honor and respect from Vietnam veterans. And so Bobby has his chance to talk. Right now is my chance. Continuing ahead, John Kerry had at least 2 self-inflicted wounds. His campaign has conceded that the first wound may have been self-inflicted in the absence of hostile fire. As to the third wound, James Rassman, a fellow who supports John Kerry, observed John Kerry throw the grenade into some rice and end up with a fanny wound. He then used those to escape Vietnam early, 243 days early, leaving everybody else there. Now, he said he was a volunteer for the Navy. As the book details, John Kerry in 1970 wrote an article in the Harvard Crimson. He was quoted extensively. At that point in time, he was trying to detach himself from the Vietnam War. He said that what happened to him was he had gotten 4 student deferments. He applied for a 5th student deferment to go to France to study. That student deferment was denied, and therefore, shortly before he was drafted, he volunteered. When he volunteered, he was on a large ship called the Gridley. He now presents that as a second tour in Vietnam. While we admire the Blue Water Navy, the Gridley was about 170 or 180 miles off the coast of Vietnam for a period of 5 or 6 weeks. This was not a tour in Vietnam as most of us would understand it. When he was in Vietnam, a great deal of his conduct was simply bizarre. You all have seen it. You know, the videotape where he stalks like a soldier with the bandoliers of ammunition, the gun pointing down on the ground. And folks, we were on swift boats. We didn't have bandoliers. And the first thing any infantryman learns is not to point his rifle towards the ground. It was actually filmed and made up to someday show. The story that we didn't put in the book that I most liked about him was literally when one guy in our squadron walked in to an empty mess hall, and John Kerry was sitting there, and he had black and green paint, camouflage paint. This was in the most safe part of the country, Cam Ranh Bay, with dirt, and he was speaking to a camera, literally like this, filming for some later use in a political campaign. He used continuously in his advertising the brown leather jacket that he parades in. We didn't wear any brown leather jacket. He spent a lot more time in that brown leather jacket campaigning than he ever spent with any of us in Vietnam. He's been total self-promotion throughout the entire time. For example, in our book, he claims to have shown up at an airport in San Francisco with so many bandages that they were coming out of his clothing. But wait, the only thing he ever had was a tiny little rice wound with a Band-Aid. This has led to debate whether he added bandages to come back to the United States or made it up in the book. And the truth is we don't know which one is true. It's interesting because he's a guy that criticizes the present administration on the basis that they cannot deal with reality. He says that they simply aren't presenting accurately what happens. I think that the thing we should do in terms of his Vietnam service is look at the 3 incidents that he picked in his short service as the primary and most important things that he did. These are the times he described as the turning point of his life, the most tragic night of his life, and the most heroic moment of his experience in Vietnam. The turning point of his life, he said, came on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day of 1968. He said in more than 50 articles, on more than 50 occasions, over a 35-year period, that he was sent on a secret mission to Cambodia on those days, that he sat in Cambodia isolated with his crew. Sometimes he populates the mission with CIA guys, sometimes not. And he listened to Richard Nixon say that we had no troops in Cambodia, that was, and it changed his entire life. He said on the floor of the Senate it was a moment that would be seared forever in his mind. He wrote an article about it in 1979. He gave interviews about it, using this as an instance of how the United States committed war crimes. That story was a total and complete fabrication. And as Vince can tell you, almost any swiftboat guy would know instantly it was a fabrication. Why? Because swiftboats in the area that John Kerry was in, along the Mekong River, didn't go anywhere close to the border with Cambodia. Instead, we found a letter that John Kerry wrote to his parents on Christmas Eve of 1968, where he described himself being snug in his bed at Sadek in central Vietnam, in his words, dreaming of sugar plums in his head. Now, we all have known people that have made up stories, but I simply ask you, how many people do you know have made up a story that they described as the turning point of their life? How many of us have ever known someone to totally fabricate the turning point of their entire life? The second story that John Kerry has told over and over again is the night he describes as the most tragic night of his life. This is an incident involving a sampan on January 20th, 1969. In this incident, John Kerry's boat indisputably shot up a sampan that had 4 people in it, a husband, a wife, a child, and a small baby. The circumstances of the sampan are disputed back and forth as to what really happened, but it's evident it was a human tragedy. What's amazing is that we got the actual report that John Kerry filed with the Department of the Navy. It's from the Navy Archives. It's not a CBS document. It's the real thing. And what actually occurred that night, what actually occurred is a tragedy. A little family was shot up, a father and a son were killed. A mother and baby were brought on board the boat. Read the report. There are 7 Viet Cong. All of a sudden, 5 of them are killed, 2 of them are captured. The mother and baby, 5,000 pounds of non-existent rice is destroyed. It's a total lie. Now, we can conceive perhaps of someone hiding a tragedy, but how many people do you know that would take a terrible tragedy and convert it into a tremendous, overwhelming victory? He sent this report to his superiors. They sent back "Bravo Zulu, congratulations." They listed this night as one of the great accomplishments of our squadron in the first quarter of 1969. And it was all based on a victory that never occurred except on John Kerry's piece of paper. He made it up completely. A third item that we might talk about is the day that he described as the most heroic moment he ever had in Vietnam. That was on the Bay Hop River on March 13, 1969. I have to carry you back a few weeks now because the account of this has much changed, along, by the way, with the description of it on the Kerry website, which has been totally changed since our book came out and our group came forward. This was No Man Left Behind. Now, I'm sure you all saw the ads and so on that were played extensively in the spring. Kerry's claim was that there were 5 PCFs, that a mine went off under the first PCF, or close to it, and that another mine went off near Kerry's boat. A man named Rasmussen, a Special Forces soldier, was knocked into the water, and Kerry and the other 4 boats all fled. And then Kerry, in a hail of fire, according to Kerry, And Kerry then looked around, realized Rassman wasn't there. Kerry had been badly wounded by the underwater mine. And Kerry came back, led everybody back. And Kerry arrived back, got Rassman in a hail of fire, pulled him on the boat, and then the Navy said, Kerry, you've just done too much in this 3 months. It's time for you to go home. That literally was John Kerry's story 3 months ago in the videotape and on his own website. As with most Kerry stories, this is a huge lie built around a small truth. What is true is that Kerry fled. That's true. And it is true that Kerry came back and picked up Rassman, who had fallen off his boat. That's true, too. The rest of the story is a lie. What actually happened, taking it step by step, how did John Kerry get wounded? The way John Kerry got wounded is that morning he threw a concussion grenade into some rice, like throwing a big firecracker into rice, and he got a tiny amount of it in his fanny. How do we know that? We know that because his book says that, literally, and his journal says that. And we know that because Jim Rassman, the man there, has admitted he saw it. And we know it most profoundly because there's never been a water mine in the world that ever put rice in a guy's fanny. This was not inconsequential because he reported it to the Navy in another false report right here that he had been wounded in the buttocks from this water mine. He then used this to be his third Purple Heart, and he headed for home with everybody else there for another 243 days. The second question, second falsehood, is what actually happened that day? What really occurred? It wasn't no man left behind. It was one man left. What actually occurred is a mine went off under PCF-3, the very first boat in the column. It was blown out of the water. It fell back down into the water. It had holes in it. 2 of the sailors from PCF-3 were blown into the water. Other people were trapped on the boat, one under the 50 caliber guns. It didn't go anywhere. It couldn't flee, as Kerry described. It couldn't move. It couldn't move at all. And what happened is 3 boats went, and they went to the aid of PCF-3. And they did that because in Vietnam, we all lived together or we died together, with one exception. They literally went to the aid of that boat. They rescued the swimmers. There was one boat that fled, just like Kerry said. That was John Kerry's boat. It fled. PCF-94 left the scene, exactly as the Washington Post concluded. In leaving, Jim Rassman fell off or was knocked off of John Kerry's boat. According to John Kerry's Senate testimony, in 1998, Jim Rassman stepped off the boat. According to Jim Rassman, a mine went off close to the boat. According to others, there was some kind of explosive near the boat. We'll never know that. But we know that Rassman did fall off the boat as Kerry fled. The other boat stayed, and the salvage and saving of PCF-3 is one of the great stories. They literally went down into the hull of the boat and plugged it with their hands so that people wouldn't die, all when Kerry was not there. And Kerry finally came back 4 or 5 minutes later. Shortly before another boat rescued Rassman, Kerry did. That's what actually happened. And there's very little dispute in that version of the facts now. What Kerry claims, and the only fact disputed, claims that when he came back there was still fire occurring. And several people on his boat claim that. Rassman claims to have seen fire. There are 11 different people, including all the other officers, who say there was absolutely no fire beyond the original mine. In addition, logs have now shown up where air cover was waved off because there was no reason for it, and there was absolutely no damage to any of the boats or anybody involved in a 75-yard wide canal, but that is the smallest of points. I don't believe that there was any fire, and our book so concluded. The final and most important thing is a totally fictitious operating report was sent to the Navy. It says there was 5,000 meters of fire, like the Battle of Gettysburg. It described, in other words, a deal as long as Seminary and Cemetery Ridge, that amount of fire occurring, a huge amount of fire. It would have taken regiments to fire so much. And a huge amount. Our administrative head in Antoi Island, he had no way of knowing whether it was true or false. That report is so ridiculous that Kerry claimed he didn't write it. There's been a very good article by Thomas Lipscomb recently that demonstrates and proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that John Kerry was the author of that report, exactly as the other 4 officers said that day. It was a totally fictitious report. Like the sampan incident, it was another big victory for Kerry that occurs only in his own reports. Why is this important? I mean, after all, this occurred a long time ago. It matters because you're talking about a man who is an incredible liar and an incredible self-promoter not 35 years ago, but 6 or 7 weeks ago at the Democratic National Convention. The second big reason that we believe Kerry would be unfit to be Commander-in-Chief, and thus much more important, are his post-Vietnam activities. When much more back to the United States, in May of 1970, he met directly with the North Vietnamese while he was a naval officer in Paris. He met not with low-ranking people, he met with Madame Binh, the chief negotiator of the National Liberation Front. He met in addition with the chief North Vietnamese negotiator, and he had discussions with them, the contents of which we'll never know. His campaign has admitted he met with them, exactly as our book says. We believe he met with them a second time in July of 1971. It is not clear to me whether his campaign has admitted that or not, but there's a substantial amount of evidence he did. In May of 1970, our unit suffered very substantial casualties in Vietnam, so it's a month that none of us will ever forget. I don't know of any other occasion in which we've had anybody in politics, much less running for Commander-in-Chief, who met directly with our enemy secretly, without authorization, in a time of war. In addition, he joined an organization called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. This was a radical organization. They took the position that war crimes were the rule in Vietnam, not the exception. John Kerry said that they were occurring on a day-to-day basis with full awareness of officers at all levels of command. They've tried to claim he was just relating other people's accounts. He wrote a book. You'll never be able to buy this book because he won't let it be reprinted. It's called The New Soldier. It's one of the most radical books you'll ever read. It begins, and people can look at it and form their own judgment physically from this copy. When his campaign threatened to sue our publisher to try and stop them from publishing this book, the try and stopper offered to publish this book for free. That was not an offer he ever took up. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War were established by a man named Al Hubbard. Hubbard claimed to be a fighter pilot. He appeared on Meet the Press with John Kerry. He was highly decorated. He was wounded by shrapnel in Vietnam. He had bombed villages and declared this to be a war crime. Problem, he was never a pilot. He didn't have those decorations. He was never in Vietnam. He was actually a sergeant in the Air Force who never became a pilot, who had hurt his back playing basketball and was on disability. That's who Al Hubbard was. He was the president. He was the guy Kerry appeared with over and over. As recently as 2 weeks ago, at the rally that was disrupted by Mueller in Washington, Steve Pitkin, another guy, Mueller who's a war criminal, another self-confessed war criminal, came in front of the entire group of 2,000 or more veterans and confessed he had made it all up because Kerry had told him to make it all up. And he apologized to all of us. He said it was something that had haunted him for his entire life. Scott Camille was another member of the group. Scott Camille, whom Kerry tried to bring up on the stage with me during a debate, was a guy who actively advocated on 2 occasions the assassination of at least 7 U.S. senators. He actually proposed it as a proposal. Now, it was voted down. That was good. And Kerry was opposed to it, but that's what you were dealing with. He was nicknamed Scotty the Assassin. He then threw all of his medals away. You all have seen that. That had a lot of significance to the 60 or so guys who have signed our letter who got real Purple Hearts, who were really wounded. The Purple Heart was our oldest medal. None of us will ever forget throwing the medals away with contempt on the Capitol steps. He then, and most significantly, made his war crimes claim. He said that these were not occasional acts, but crimes committed on a day-to-day basis. He listed rape, murder, cutting limbs off. He called us the army of Genghis Khan, said that's how we behaved. It was a lie. While there were random war crimes in Vietnam, like any war, all studies have shown that there were less than most wars, and in fact, they were prosecuted. There were 225 capital prosecutions in Vietnam. In addition, there were numerous instances where we did things to avoid civilian casualties. A good example of this is in the Second World War, we used B-52s. We bombed cities. In Vietnam, in terms of populated areas, we used light attack planes. We lost over 100 people from the Naval Academy who were flyers. We lost them because they were in small planes trying to avoid civilian casualties. In our little unit, in an area called the Dam Doi, We moved slowly, and we broadcast with propaganda speakers, and we lost people over and over again because we did that. The words he said, which were false, did not stop with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, nor did his book. We know now that they were used specifically to torture prisoners of war in North Vietnam, in the Hanoi Hilton. At least 20 of them have talked about that. The thing they remember is the army of Genghis Khan. They remember that language being used by Kerry. The prisoners of war, of course, were resisting confessing to war crimes. They were being tortured to confess to war crimes, and they were confronted with the testimony of one of their own guys that war crimes were occurring every day in Vietnam as a matter of policy. You know, most of them resisted even that because they thought something like that could never happen in the United States. When you talk to them, they thought Kerry's testimony was all made up by somebody in North Vietnam. They didn't think it had really happened in the United States. The charges were used to strengthen our enemy in the field. John Kerry, in fact, if you take a look at the museum in Saigon, and the pictures are in the book, is honored as a foreign hero who helped them win the war in the Hall of Foreign Heroes. He's one of only 2 Americans so honored. The Hall of Foreign Heroes is like a Cooperstown of bad guys. It's got Fidel Castro, it's got people you wouldn't like from all over the world, and it's got John Kerry right there. As far as we know, John Kerry is only the 2nd American fighting man ever to be honored by the government he ostensibly fought against over his service in the war where he was supposedly fighting against them. The charges maligned our service, and the charges maligned our dead. We have uncounted thousands of people who died in the Vietnam War buried in Arlington. We have 55 of the guys from our unit who we lost over there, many people from the Naval Academy. The truth is that all of us who served in Vietnam know them by 1s and by 2s and by 3s. We don't know them as 58,000 people. They were the best people we ever knew. They were just great. They were kids. All they had was their honor, the honor of their service, their good name in their lives, and they gave up their lives. And he took away their name, and he took away the honor of their service. That's what he actually really did. Those kids never grew old. They laid down their life for their neighbor. They didn't vote to go to Vietnam. They just served there when the country asked them. I think that, in summary, dealing just with that second point, that they would say, please don't allow John Kerry to convert betrayal into an award of the presidency of the United States of America.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to take questions from the audience, and CAN TV will film this, so when you have questions, go over there, and starting off with Maureen Murphy.
And with a tear in my eye, I am
Just
so
a few
moved
words.
by this
Pardon?
testimony
I wasn't
today.
quite finished my speech.
John, thank you. My husband was a Vietnam veteran, and we did, I lost a neighbor on our block, as I told you. And I'm the mother of sons, and I'm very proud of this country. I have been asking for weeks since the Democratic Convention, why would this man, Kerry, wrap himself in the Vietnam War? Because those of us that were around then know it was the LBJ War. And I think you sort of outlined why that it was, again, prefabricated to fit some future run. And you had commented on that, but also I saw you on some local TV station, and I would hope that with Illinois possibly being in play, if there's a few shekels out there to get these ads on Illinois TV, I'd really encourage it.
Thank you all. The problem that the Kerry campaign has with the book is it's 210 very specific pages. Most of the book is supported by extensive documentation as well as the testimony of people. We have 274 people. They have 15 or 20 from that unit. And the Vietnam, post-Vietnam stuff is just true as a matter of law. I mean, he went and he met in Paris with the North Vietnamese. He's admitted it. You can listen to the words on tape from the Senate testimony. Anybody can see them. This book, even though they hide it, it's a real book. I mean, nobody made it up. It's actually his book. He really did those things. You can go to the museum in Saigon. You can see him honored on the wall there. It's a 1993 photograph, but it's done to honor his service in the Vietnam War for them, according to the inscription on the wall. And so that's pretty sad. That's what's actually happened. And when we began this, we didn't know where it would take us, this road for all of our guys. Admiral Hoffman, Thurlow, all the guys that have appeared on television, our job is just to put the word out. Then you have to let the chips fall where they may. If people listen to this and determine they want Kerry, that's their own business. If they listen to this and determine they don't want him, they're entitled to this information. But we couldn't live with ourselves unless we came forward and put this out. That's the truth of it.
Thank you for your courage.
Okay, let's keep the questions short because you have a lot of you standing there. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sandy. I show those sons. I'm John Kerry. I'm a lawyer. In the late 70s, I was an attorney for Vietnamese refugees under an American Bar Association program. At that time, 1977, 78, tens of thousands of refugees from Vietnam left in fear of communism. They were referred to as the boat people because they left, many of them on rickety boats, the only option open to them. At that time, Joan Baez, an anti-war protester, came out and said, you know, if I'm for human rights in the early 70s, I'm for it in the late 70s, and she denounced the communists in Vietnam for their repression of Vietnamese. However, the Vietnam Vets Against the War and STS and other alums of the anti-war movement denounced her and made her change her view. Do you know what was John Kerry's position regarding the boat people in the late 70s when the Vietnam he left was now totally communist? Thank you.
It was amazing to me. I debated John Kerry in 1971. We were in an area, the Human Forest. Kerry was there for for 2 or 3 months. I was there for a much longer period, 11 or 12 months. We would recover at least 1 to 2 people a week who were just killed. I mean, they were shot in the back of the head and dumped into the river or the canal by the North Vietnamese. We particularly did that, also occurred in the area of the Ba Sac River, where we recovered several bodies. We were asked the question by Dick Cavett, do we really believe in the cliche of a bloodbath? I said, I thought if we left, there would be a terrible bloodbath. Kerry said it was lunacy to talk about that. There might be at most 3,000 people who would have to leave the country. He also spoke about, not in that debate, but in many other speeches, about Ho Chi Minh being a George Washington who was simply trying to bring a constitution to Vietnam. It was some constitution. It was a bullet in the back of the head for 2.5 million Cambodians, for about 1.5 million Vietnamese. There was a real reason why they all fled. There's a reason why you see more than 1 million of them in the United States. There were whole tribes in Laos that were wiped out. He totally failed to recognize, charitably, totally failed to recognize the nature of the people that were on the other side of us. And as a result, Vietnam remains a country vastly behind in both human liberty and economic freedom, almost all the other countries in Asia.
You asked the question, how many people do you know that can turn an enormous tragedy into a victory? I know of one person right now. And what's going on in Iraq and in Afghanistan is a tragedy, is a failure of leadership. And by you bringing up issues that occurred 30, 35 years ago, I don't see how insulting an individual.
Let him make his speech, but the chair will ask you to summarize it in 1 sentence so we can continue, sir.
Summarize in 1 sentence, you should be ashamed of yourself, sir.
I'd like to just say, Chris, we honor your service, honor the Kerry guys even for bringing you here, as they did the other tables. There's not a day that passes when Buzz Patterson down there and I don't get 8 to 10 emails directly from people in Iraq who say, for God's sake, tell them, don't let Kerry in. There's a poll that you can read. There's a poll in USA Today yesterday. It says that over 80% of the people in Iraq and Afghanistan are in favor of Bush. Less than 13% are in favor of Kerry. In the military, there's a saying, it's the 10% who didn't get the word. Kerry has about half of the 10% who didn't get the word.
do have a question. I'm Michael Bauer, I'm a longtime State Club member. My college years were 1969 to 73 up in Northwestern in suburban Chicago. And as you may recall, I and millions of other Americans spent much of those years marching in protest against the war in Vietnam. Do you think I and the millions of Americans who were marching at the same time I was were being in any way unpatriotic?
No, exactly. Let me answer. Not at all. If I can answer, at the Naval Academy, I went to school, and at the Naval Academy, I was taught by Lieutenant Colonel. Excuse me.
The chair will have some order here, or we'll empty the place. So ask the question, you ask the question, and the gentleman will respond.
Lieutenant Colonel Corson resigned his commission in the Marine Corps in order to oppose the Vietnam War. I thought he was a man of courage in doing that. I've never had any problem with that. I have a tremendous problem with meeting with the North Vietnamese, meeting directly with our enemies while a naval officer in time of war. I have a terrible problem with calling the guys you serve with and the other people there criminals when they really weren't, and when you know a lot of them were killed. I have a terrible problem with calling Ho Chi Minh George Washington. Those are not, this was not the real, I have a horrible problem with joining an organization where a lot of the people were fakes, and an organization that seeks to criminalize all the guys who can't talk back because they're out in the trenches. And none of those things are things you did. I have no problem at all with what you did.
My name is Todd Fox. I'm a Chicago attorney. I have a very short question, no speeches. Obviously, you pretty well debunked the Christmas in Cambodia claim. My question is, you've gone farther than that and stated that John Kerry was never in Cambodia. My question is, how can you be sure?
Here's how I know it. First of all, in the area that John Kerry was at, on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, our boats didn't go any further north than Sadek. In the remaining area that we were in, it was an area that was commonly called Bernice Creek. This is the area Kerry would have gone in after he moved to Antoy, and that I would have moved in. It was an area about 100 or 150 yards from the Cambodian border. It was difficult to get into Cambodia from there. I checked with every commanding officer. None of them knew anything about him going there. There was no evidence from anyone I talked to he had ever been there. I looked at the operating reports. There is no operating report from any trip there. Our swift boats could be heard 1.5 miles to 2 miles away. Nobody would ever use them for a secret mission. And most of all, the guy that's supposedly a war hero but doesn't even have the courage to address this is John Kerry. He's been completely silent.
Thank you, Mr. Lyon.
Next question.
Yes, sir. You and I haven't met, probably won't. My name's Skip Barker. I'm a cotton farmer from Alabama. I was skipper of the 31 boat, trained with John Kerry, been in country with John Kerry, was with him in the Mekong Delta during combat. Here's the question. There's a guy named George Elliott. He was my division commander. He was John Kerry's division commander. He wrote a report on the fitness of John Kerry as a naval officer. It's dated in December of 1969. It covers the entire time John Kerry was in combat. And it says that John Kerry's leadership in combat situations, often requiring immediate, incisive action, is unsurpassed. It says John Kerry emerges as the acknowledged leader of the entire peer group. That peer group was every one of the lieutenant junior grades, including Skip Barker, in that picture you referred to earlier. Sir, why doesn't your book quote the laudatory, the outstanding comments about John Kerry in his fitness report by a professional officer in the United States Navy?
Mr. Barker, first of all, I honor your service. Mr. Barker is one of the 3 people in that picture of 15, and one of the 4 out of the 23 officers in our unit that support John Kerry. You can see that people have been flown all over, and what you're getting to see, by the way, is, as far as I can tell, all the Swiftboat people in the whole world that support John Kerry. If you want to go to Washington, this weekend, you'll see over 100 of us on the other side. But I'd like to answer directly your question. Commander Elliott said it the best of all. Commander Elliott only got to see John Kerry for about 2 months. Let's see. This is the tremendous victory that John Kerry had on January the 20th, 1969, Skip, where he shot the 7 Viet Cong, except it was a little family that Commander Elliott was never told about. Then there's a report, Skip, on March the 13th, where John Kerry went through the 5,000 meters of fire that it turns out nobody else heard, and Commander Elliott wasn't there. Commander Elliott put it best of all. He said, as Winston Churchill said, the guy who writes history is always treated well by it. Commander Elliott was systematically lied to by John Kerry in the short period of time that he was there. In terms of our book, we address directly the fitness reports. We point out that John Kerry was placed in the middle of the group at Antoy, that Commander Elliott believed everyone should get a superior report, and he gave a superior report to John Kerry, just like he did everyone else, including Skip Barker.
Okay. We're going to extend this to about 10-2, which is 3 minutes, so nobody had any more people on the line because we're trying to clear it up. Go ahead, please.
This wasn't my question, but something you just brought up. Is there anything you know that establishes factually that the Kerry campaign flew anybody here?
Well, let's see. There's a coincidence. We've got someone from... Wait, hang on. Yes, I'd like to talk, can I? We have a table paid for by the Kerry campaign there with Bobby Mueller, whom I remember disrupting me 30 years ago. Here.
Sir, do you have a question about the book or about the gentleman here? We're not talking about anything else. Go ahead. Do you have a question?
Well, it's a coincidence. You've all just arrived on the same day.
First, the fact that just more people bought it.
What a coincidence.
You raise a number of points that you say are definitive of unfit for command. You talk about self-inflicted wounds, which is a term of art, which you know full well that throwing a grenade into anything that sends shrapnel back is not.
It's got to be a question, not a speech, sir.
The question is going to be, when a man like you says self-inflicted, which is not like going out your eardrum with a shotgun to stab Vietnam, leaving early versus not going at all, using the constitutional rights that you were sworn to uphold to oppose a war that any American is entitled to do, what has turned this country into such a situation that you can say somebody who exercised constitutional rights after facing combat for his country renders him unfit for command, as opposed to someone who cheers for war and refuses to go and put himself in harm's way?
I can respond. There may be an amazing coincidence occurring here, where Skip has come from Alabama and Wasser has come from another area of the country, and Bobby, he was in Washington disrupting our rally 2 weeks ago. That could occur. I don't know. Maybe they've all just merged here at the same place. I have a suspicion, though. Now, to try and answer exactly his question, what I meant by a self-inflicted wound is very clear. I mean that he fired a grenade, and inadvertently, he wounded himself in a tiny way. We're talking about a rose thorn. That's now admitted. The Kerry campaign lied about it initially. They've admitted now. With respect to being there for a short time, Vice not coming there at all, what I'll tell you this is that the tiny zero contribution John Kerry made to us, he's a man who struck a death blow to us when he came back here. He's the guy that created the Kerry structure of all of us as baby killers and murderers. He's the guy whose words were used to torture our POWs. And we wish he just would have stayed home and left us all alone. And that's what everybody in our unit, they asked him to leave. They asked him to leave. Finally, with respect to protest activities, we all have a right to protest, but then we have a right to be called to account for what we say. John Kerry had a right. He had a perfect right, a constitutional right, to call us murderers, to say that we were the army of Genghis Khan, to say that we were shooting, crucifying people, cutting them limb from limb. It may have been a lie, but he had a constitutional right. What we're saying is, don't, for God's sake, award this man with the presidency of the United States of America for doing it.
Next, please.
Thank you. I'm one of the supporters of your group. Probably someone will do so again. I would like to ask a question to the SBS. Are you aware of the reason why you're getting so much resistance? because people on the left side of the aisle are suffering from truth deficit disorder.
I would like to say you've heard any number of people come up. I think they were flown in. It's a little short book. It's 210 pages long. Everybody I ever know that reads this book, it's not about Republican or Democrat. They say, God, if you read this book, if this is true, whether you're Republican, a Democrat, or liberal or conservative, this guy should never be the commander-in-chief. We've got people flying in from all over. There's nobody pointing out very much wrong with this book.
Yes, sir. Marty?
My name is Marty Gleason. I'm a member of the City Club. I flew in this morning from Hinsdale, Burr Ridge area. I listened with some thoughtful intent.
Marty, it's going to be a question now, right?
Yes, it is. It's certainly going to be a question, Tom. And the question I have is, considering where John Kerry was, what he did, and your conclusion and another writer's conclusion that he's unfit for command, would you mind explaining where George Bush was and why he is fit for command? I think that's an appropriate question for today.
It's a fair question. The problem you have is you've asked it to the wrong person. We didn't serve with George Bush. Can't comment on his service, and someone else would have to. But I would like to say this. We've had an awful lot of presidents of the United States who have been great commanders-in-chief who never served anywhere. Woodrow Wilson, I think, was one of our greatest. Franklin Roosevelt commanded us all the way through the Second World War. He was never in the Navy or the Army. Part of the fraud of Kerry is the idea of trying to elevate the 3 months into something that disqualifies everybody else but him, when none of us who are veterans feel that way. But I'll tell you this, we never had a guy that met with the enemy when we were at war. We never had a guy that called our kids, living and dead, war criminals, who ever even had the courage to run for President of the United States before this.
Next question.
I was a Whitwell veteran. I was in Antoy in 1968 and 1969. I served with John Kerry. And I have two questions. Did you ever serve with John Kerry in Vietnam? My second question is, how long were you in Antoy? I was there for 12 months.
I never served directly with John Kerry in Vietnam. More than 60 people who contributed to our book did. They're listed in the book. They include the entire chain of command that commanded Kerry, 17 of the 23 officers that served directly with him, a large majority of all the sailors there. How long did I serve in Antoy? I can promise you it was not 3 months like John Kerry. I arrived in Vietnam in May of 1969. I went not to Cam Ranh Bay, but to Vung Tau. I operated in Coastal Division 13 for about 6 or 8 weeks. I went to Antoy in the summer of 1969 and was there until May of 1970. When I came back to the United States, my tour was at 12 months, that tour. I was on a small minesweeper called the USS Woodpecker that operated before that close in Vietnam, operated out of Cat Lo in the Runsat Special Zone. But as to your question, Antoy, I was there about 10 months.
I might say enough said.
Okay. Final question? Yes, sir.
How you doing, Mr. O'Neill? My name is Joel Colon. I'm a recent returned veteran from Afghanistan. I'm a lifetime member of the VFW, and I am using my constitutional right this year to support John Kerry. Now, I have a question for you. Basically, it's not about the content of your book, but basically of your motivation to do this. I'm more concerned with the recent issue that's going on today in Iraq and Afghanistan. I have a brother in Iraq. I have many friends who are serving in Afghanistan and Iraq. Truthfully, do you feel you are doing the American soldier a favor by making our presidential candidates refight Vietnam when today they should be fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan?
You know, John Kerry said in the recent presidential debate that he met 2 people from Afghanistan and Iraq who had asked him to please go ahead and do this. I think we've now identified probably the only 2 people. Because truthfully, we get hundreds of emails from kids in Afghanistan and Iraq, from people in the Marines, from people in the Army, people in the Navy. Buzz has the same experience, and all our guys do, and they beg us, please go forward. So they think we're doing the right thing. Do I think I'm doing the right thing? Yeah. I don't think that our allies in Iraq, in the middle of a war, should be called the coalition of the corrupt and the bribed. I don't think the guy that is trying to help us at the risk of his life, Alawi, should be termed a pawn. Everybody I talk to from there, and we have 3 or 4 in our firm, say that we're doing the right thing. But the one thing I am sure of, and people can form their own mind, I'm sure that a guy, what would you think if somebody went and met with the Al-Qaeda to cut a separate deal right when they got home, like Kerry did with the North Vietnamese? What would you think if he characterized all of you as war criminals as he did us? It's inconceivable that such a man could be made the Commander-in-Chief of the United States.
Okay, the real final question.
I'm just wondering, probably a great many of the people in the audience are familiar with the cover of the John Kerry book, which has been suppressed, therefore we cannot purchase it. Would you be good enough to describe precisely the cover of that book for all of us?
Yes, this is the John Kerry book, The New Soldier, which I offered to publish for free at my own cost in the Wall Street Journal. The cover makes fun of Iwo Jima. The flag raising on Iwo Jima at Mount Suribachi was probably the greatest moment in the history of the Navy and Marine Corps. My dad was on Iwo Jima. He was a fighter pilot. He went ashore on Iwo Jima because our own planes were killing a lot of our own Marines. His life was saved there. We lost 7,000 Marines on Iwo Jima. It wasn't anything to make fun of. That's what this is. You can read the book. It's one radical comment, like basic training is genocide training. It's got comments by people like Steve Pitkin that they were animals in Vietnam, people who came back and said, we're sorry, it wasn't the truth. He told us to say it. It's got fake after fake in the book. That's what's in this book. There's never been a book written by an American presidential candidate like this book. We all grew up on Profiles in Courage and a lot of other books we could be proud of.
Okay, thank you, John O'Neill.